What if the most dangerous thing about you was not where you lived, who you trusted, or the choices you made, but the name written on your birth certificate? Imagine a city where randomness feels organized, where order itself becomes a weapon, and where meaning hides inside something as ordinary as the alphabet. In the shadows of 1970s New York, fear once moved without direction, until a chilling pattern quietly emerged. This story unfolds in a time when the city's darkness closed in from every direction. Crime surged, trust eroded, and families locked their doors earlier each night. Young girls vanished without warning, their names aligning in chilling symmetry. What remained was an unsolved mystery, a cold case defined by silence, coincidence, and a logic that felt disturbingly inhuman. Tonight, you are invited into the alphabet murders, where reason fractures, and the search for meaning becomes its own quiet torment. New York in the 1970s was no longer the polished symbol of post-war optimism it once claimed to be. The city felt tired, stretched thin by economic decline, social division, and a crime rate that seemed to rise faster than anyone could contain. What had once been confidence slowly curdled into vigilance, and public spaces carried an undercurrent of tension that never fully receded. Daily life continued, but it did so cautiously. Streets that once felt routine now demanded awareness. Subway rides required alertness, and evening walks were shortened or avoided altogether. Safety was no longer assumed as a background condition of life. It became a calculation families made every single day, often without realizing how much fear had already shaped their habits. Parents absorbed this anxiety through the steady rhythm of the evening news. Reports of assaults, disappearances, and unexplained deaths blended into one continuous warning. Each broadcast reinforced the sense that danger was not an exception, but a presence woven into the city itself. Over time, fear stopped feeling dramatic and began to feel practical. Children were instructed carefully and repeatedly. They were told to come home before dark, to stay with friends, and to avoid strangers at all costs. These instructions were delivered with seriousness, not hysteria. They were survival strategies passed down by adults who understood that the city was no longer forgiving of innocence. Within this uneasy environment lived ordinary families who worked hard to preserve normalcy. Many were working-class households defined by structure, responsibility, and the hope that stability could be built through discipline. These families believed in routine as protection and in moral order as a shield against chaos. Like most people, they believed tragedy had an address somewhere else. Danger was imagined as distant, contained within unfamiliar neighborhoods or reckless lifestyles. It was easier to believe that careful families were exempt, that obedience and good intentions still mattered in a city unraveling at its edges. Among these families were young girls, standing quietly at the threshold between childhood and adulthood. Their lives were simple and largely predictable. School shaped their weekdays, family obligations filled their evenings, and modest dreams occupied their thoughts. Their sense of the future was not ambitious, but it was sincere. Education promised possibility, even if it was vague. Family promised protection, even if it was imperfect. Tomorrow felt like an extension of today, not a rupture from it. Nothing in their routines suggested imminent danger. There were no visible signs that their lives were about to be reduced to headlines and police files. One of these girls was Carmen Colon, a name that would later be spoken with sorrow and unease. Before that, she was simply a child within a modest household guided by expectations of respect and responsibility. Her world was small, orderly, and governed by rules meant to keep her safe. Carmen's days followed a familiar rhythm. School demanded attention and obedience. Home required cooperation and trust. Like many children raised in disciplined environments, she believed that following rules minimized risk. Obedience felt like a form of protection, something that could keep the world predictable. Teachers remembered her as quiet and polite, attentive, without drawing attention to herself. She was not known for rebellion or defiance, but for compliance and gentleness. She trusted adults instinctively, believing authority figures existed to guide rather than harm. Her dreams were not dramatic. She imagined growing older, helping her family, and building a life that felt stable and earned. These were not fantasies of escape, but hopes rooted in continuity. The future was something she expected to arrive naturally, not something she feared losing. What connected Carmen to the other victims was not vulnerability in the conventional sense. They were not reckless, isolated, or ignored. They shared no behavioral patterns that typically raise alarm. Instead, they were linked by something so ordinary, it initially escaped notice entirely. Their first and last names began with the same letter. At the time, this detail appeared meaningless, one coincidence among countless others scattered across the city. Names were identifiers, not risks. No one believed identity itself could become a selection criterion. Yet around these girls existed adults whose presence only gained significance in hindsight. Neighbors, acquaintances, and passers-by blended seamlessly into the city's constant movement. Familiarity masked scrutiny, and repeated exposure created comfort rather than suspicion. Some individuals appeared too often or lingered too long. Some watched without interaction, or offered help where none was requested. None of this crossed a clear boundary at the time. In a crowded city, proximity was not unusual, and observation rarely felt threatening. Psychologically, this is where danger often thrives. Those driven by control rarely announce themselves through aggression. Instead, they rely on invisibility, embedding themselves within routines until their presence feels unremarkable. They study patterns patiently, waiting for moments that feel both ordinary and unguarded. This form of threat exploits trust rather than force. It depends on the belief that familiar environments are safe and that danger wears an obvious face. Control-oriented individuals often appear calm, predictable, and unassuming, which allows them to operate unnoticed for extended periods. The neighborhoods themselves reinforced this illusion of safety. Streets were familiar, neighbors recognizable, and daily routines rarely changed. Security was informal, built on mutual awareness rather than formal protection. It felt sufficient because it had never truly been tested. Beneath this surface, however, existed vulnerabilities no one wanted to confront. Family secrets remained unspoken, warnings went unheeded, and social blind spots widened quietly. The city's systems were fragmented, leaving spaces where accountability faded and responsibility became diffuse. This combination of familiarity, routine, and unexamined trust created an environment where harm could grow undetected. It was not chaos that allowed the nightmare to form, but order that went unquestioned. Stability became camouflage rather than protection. This was New York before the nightmare fully revealed itself, a city still clinging to the belief that order governed outcomes, and that meaning followed logic. No one yet imagined that something as simple as a name could become a marker of fate, or that identity itself could quietly be turned into a death sentence. Each disappearance began in complete normalcy, woven into the quiet rhythm of an ordinary day. The victims left home for familiar reasons, walking known routes toward places they trusted. Nothing felt urgent or unusual. No instinct signaled danger, and no moment hinted that this routine departure would be their last. There were no lingering goodbyes, no pauses heavy with unease. Doors closed as they always had. Time moved forward without hesitation. In retrospect, this ordinariness would become one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. Evil did not announce itself with disruption. It slipped quietly into routine, borrowing the disguise of normal life. Later, witnesses tried to reconstruct those final hours. They remembered brief encounters that had seemed insignificant at the time. Someone recalled seeing a girl speaking calmly with an adult. Another remembered a child changing direction at a corner she usually passed straight through. These moments had not triggered concern because they did not violate expectations. Cities are built on brief, meaningless interactions. These fragments gained weight only after the fact. Once fear demanded context, what had been forgettable became scrutinized. What had seemed harmless was now replayed repeatedly, searching for clues that might explain how the world had tilted so suddenly. Yet memory is fragile under pressure, and recollection became an unreliable witness. In several cases, the last confirmed interactions came from individuals whose stories evolved over time. Initial statements were vague, cautious, and incomplete. As investigations intensified, details shifted, timelines stretched or collapsed, certainty dissolved into contradiction. This was not always deception. Often it was the mind responding to fear, guilt, or the instinct to protect oneself from suspicion. Psychologically, this instability is expected. When individuals realize their memories might implicate them, even indirectly, perception changes. Memory reshapes itself around survival. What remains is not necessarily truth or falsehood, but distortion. Investigators were left navigating accounts that felt sincere yet unreliable. There were signs that something was wrong, though they were almost invisible in the moment. A route taken that made little sense, a delay that could not be explained, a short conversation that felt oddly misplaced within the day's rhythm. None of these were alarming enough to interrupt the flow of life. Such anomalies were easily dismissed as childish spontaneity. Children, after all, do not always move logically. They change plans, follow impulses, and trust strangers more readily than adults would advise. These assumptions, grounded in everyday experience, allowed warning signs to pass unnoticed. Then came the silence, and with it, a growing sense of dread. Hours passed without contact. Familiar reassurances failed to arrive. Families waited, pacing between hope and panic, telling themselves that delays happened and that worry was premature. The city continued moving around them, indifferent to their fear. As days passed, concern hardened into terror. Parents searched neighborhoods, neighbors joined briefly, then withdrew, unsure how long to remain involved. Reports were filed. Questions multiplied. Each unanswered hour deepened the sense that something irreversible had occurred. Absence became the loudest signal. It filled rooms and conversations, pressing itself into every moment of waiting. Silence, once neutral, now carried meaning. It spoke of disruption, of something stolen that might never return. For families, this silence was unbearable. When the bodies were eventually discovered, they were not found near the places of last sighting. They lay in isolated locations, distant from the warmth and familiarity of home. These settings did not suggest chaos or panic. They suggested deliberation. Placement mattered. Distance mattered. The scenes themselves were striking for their restraint. There was no spectacle, no excess meant to shock. Violence was present, but it was implied rather than emphasized. The absence of overt brutality made the crimes feel colder, more calculated. This was not an outburst. It was a process. For families, hope collapsed in an instant. Shock overwhelmed reason. Denial briefly protected the mind, then gave way to grief that felt physical in its weight. Time fractured permanently. Life would now be measured against a single dividing line, before and after. Law enforcement began reviewing the cases side by side, initially with hesitation. Differences existed, locations varied, timelines did not align neatly, yet something beneath the surface felt familiar, as though the crimes were speaking the same language in different dialects. Slowly, similarities emerged, not in obvious ways, but through repetition of subtle choices. Investigators sensed an underlying structure, an invisible framework guiding the acts. This realization unsettled them, because structure implied intention. The revelation that followed arrived gradually, almost reluctantly. Each victim's first and last name began with the same letter. At first, this seemed absurd. Names are arbitrary. Coincidences happen. Yet, as cases accumulated, chance became an insufficient explanation. This was not randomness, it was selection. Identity itself had become a criterion. The killer was not choosing victims based on opportunity alone, but on a symbolic marker embedded in who they were. Names, usually neutral labels, had been transformed into targets. This discovery changed the psychological understanding of the crimes. The acts were no longer isolated tragedies. They were expressions of a private system, a logic invisible to others but rigidly followed by the offender. The alphabet had become a framework for control. Compounding the mystery were failures in infrastructure and documentation. Cameras that should have captured movements were inexplicably inactive. Records were incomplete. Files lacked details that could have anchored timelines or confirmed sightings. Evidence that might have provided clarity simply did not exist. These absences were not conspiratorial, but systemic. The technology of the time was limited. Resources were strained. Human error filled the gaps. Yet together, these missing pieces created an environment where certainty could not survive. This convergence of pattern and absence forced investigators to confront a disturbing possibility. If names were chosen deliberately, then the offender was not impulsive. This was someone capable of patience, planning, and restraint. Someone operating according to an internal order rather than emotional chaos. The question became unavoidable and deeply unsettling. Was this a normal crime distorted by coincidence, or was it something far more methodical and controlled? As the pattern emerged, so did the realization that understanding this case would require more than evidence. It would require entering a mindset where meaning was imposed, where none should exist. The investigation initially appeared to move toward clarity. Detectives focused their attention on a primary suspect, whose proximity to the victims raised immediate concern. This individual's movements overlapped with critical timelines, and certain behaviors felt unsettling enough to justify scrutiny. Interrogations followed, backgrounds were examined, and past actions were reinterpreted through the lens of suspicion. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that the case was approaching resolution. That sense of progress did not last. As interviews continued and evidence was revisited, inconsistencies began to surface. Witness accounts conflicted with one another, and timelines that once appeared stable no longer aligned under closer examination. Details that had felt convincing when viewed in isolation lost their coherence when placed alongside other facts. What had seemed solid began to feel constructed rather than discovered. This erosion of certainty exposed a deeper problem. In the urgency to find answers, some investigative paths were narrowed too quickly. Leads that did not immediately reinforce the dominant theory were quietly set aside. Indirect evidence, subtle behavioral indicators, and alternative suspects were dismissed as distractions rather than possibilities worth sustained attention. This pattern is not unusual in high-profile cases. When public fear escalates and pressure mounts, investigations often drift toward conclusions that offer emotional relief rather than factual completeness. Closure becomes a priority, even when truth remains incomplete. In such environments, patience is perceived as failure, and doubt becomes politically inconvenient. As media involvement intensified, the character of the case changed. Headlines began to frame the crimes with dramatic language, transforming private grief into public narrative. The name Alphabet Murders entered circulation, offering the public a label that made the horror feel structured and comprehensible. Naming the crimes created the illusion of understanding, even as the reality remained fragmented. This media framing amplified fear across communities. Parents adjusted routines, escorting children more closely and limiting independence. Schools introduced new safety measures, and neighborhoods grew wary of unfamiliar faces. Vigilance increased, but so did suspicion, often without direction or evidence. At the same time, families of the victims faced an entirely different kind of exposure. Their mourning became subject to public evaluation. Strangers questioned their decisions, their parenting, and even their reactions to loss. Grief was no longer private. It was observed, analyzed, and sometimes weaponized by speculation. Public discourse produced a wide range of theories, some grounded in reasonable inference, others bordering on fantasy. One prevailing belief suggested the killer knew the victims personally. According to this view, familiarity enabled access, trust, and opportunity. The crimes were seen as extensions of existing relationships rather than random encounters. Another theory proposed a ritualistic offender driven by obsessive compulsions. The alphabetical pattern appeared to support this idea, suggesting a mind fixated on order and repetition. In this framework, the victims were symbols rather than individuals, selected to satisfy an internal rule rather than personal motive. A third hypothesis introduced a more unsettling possibility. The true perpetrator may never have appeared in official investigative records at all. This individual could have existed entirely outside the field of suspicion, protected by anonymity, mobility, or social invisibility. In this scenario, the investigation searched the wrong perimeter from the beginning. These competing explanations fractured public understanding rather than clarifying it. Each theory accounted for certain elements while leaving others unexplained. None could fully reconcile the pattern, the timing, and the absence of definitive evidence. The case resisted the kind of narrative cohesion people instinctively seek. This resistance is psychologically significant. Humans are wired to impose meaning on chaos. When events defy interpretation, discomfort grows. The Alphabet Murders denied resolution not because answers were impossible, but because the available frameworks were insufficient. The truth did not fit neatly within any single explanation. Investigators periodically returned to the files, driven by the hope that distance might reveal what immediacy obscured. New eyes reviewed old reports. Fresh questions were asked of familiar facts. Each return promised clarity, yet delivered only repetition. The same contradictions reappeared, unchanged. The passage of time did not soften the uncertainty. Instead, it hardened it. Witness memories faded further, physical evidence degraded, and contextual details became harder to reconstruct. The past grew increasingly opaque, resistant to modern interpretation, despite improved methods. At one point, a new development briefly reignited optimism. A detail previously overlooked surfaced, ambiguous but intriguing enough to suggest a potential breakthrough. Expectations rose cautiously, fueled by the possibility that the case had been misunderstood rather than unsolvable. That hope dissolved quickly. Under scrutiny, the new lead failed to connect meaningfully with the existing evidence, What had appeared promising collapsed into another dead end. Once again, the investigation confronted the limits of what could be known. With that final collapse of momentum, the case slipped back into uncertainty once again. It never truly closed, yet it refused to move forward in any meaningful way. Suspended between partial explanations and unanswered questions, it remained unresolved but impossible to forget. The Alphabet murders endured not as a concluded investigation, but as a lingering presence within the public consciousness. It became less a crime with an ending and more a persistent question, one that resisted resolution and continued to echo quietly, reminding investigators and families alike that some cases do not fade, even when time moves on. This unresolved state carries its own psychological weight. It leaves room for fear to persist without boundary. Without resolution, the crimes remain active in the collective imagination, capable of resurfacing whenever order feels fragile. The absence of answers becomes a presence in itself. The Alphabet murders continue to endure because they quietly challenge one of our deepest assumptions about crime and human behavior. We want to believe that logic is guided by morality, and that patterns exist to reveal meaning. This case suggests otherwise. It shows how order can exist without compassion, and how structure can emerge without purpose that comforts us. By refusing closure, the case forces us to confront an unsettling truth. Some answers remain unreachable not because they are deliberately hidden, but because they do not align with the narratives we rely on to make sense of violence, justice, and the human mind itself. To understand this case, it is necessary to move away from timelines and evidence boards and step into psychology. The deliberate selection of victims according to alphabetical order signals something far removed from impulsive violence. This was not chaos erupting spontaneously. It was violence disciplined by an internal rule, guided by a private logic that existed independently of morality or empathy. Such behavior points toward an obsession with structure. In criminal psychology, patterned selection often reflects a mind that feels internally fragmented. When the inner world is unstable, some individuals attempt to regulate it by imposing order on the external world. The alphabet, simple and universally understood, offers a ready-made system. It is neutral, impersonal, and absolute. By using it, the offender transforms randomness into control. Control, in this context, is not about efficiency. It is about power. The act of choosing victims by name suggests a desire to dominate fate itself. Identity becomes reduced to a symbol, stripped of individuality, and transformed into a component within a rigid sequence. This allows the offender to experience mastery over something abstract and untouchable: chance. From a Stoic perspective, this behavior reflects an inability to accept uncertainty. Stoic philosophy teaches endurance of the uncontrollable and discipline of the self. Here, the opposite occurs. Rather than accepting the unpredictability of existence, the individual attempts to conquer it. Rules replace resilience. Control becomes a counterfeit form of peace, one that temporarily suppresses anxiety while deepening inner disorder. This need for order does not resolve suffering, it amplifies it. The more rigid the structure, the more fragile it becomes. Any deviation threatens collapse. In this way, the offender becomes enslaved to the very system they created, compelled to repeat behaviors in order to maintain the illusion of control. Buddhist thought offers one lens through which this fixation can be understood. Buddhism teaches that attachment to form, identity, and outcome inevitably produces dukkha or suffering. The killer's obsession with names reveals a deep attachment to symbols rather than lived reality. Names, which are ultimately empty labels, are mistaken for essence. Structure is mistaken for meaning, and control is mistaken for liberation. From a Christian perspective, this distortion reflects a rejection of divine order, grounded in love. Power is pursued in place of humility, and human life is reduced to an object rather than recognized as sacred. In both traditions, suffering emerges when control replaces compassion and ego replaces moral responsibility. In this framework, the violence does not originate from hatred alone, but from clinging. The offender clings to order, to sequence, to the belief that meaning can be forced upon the world. This clinging generates suffering not only for the victims, but for the offender as well. Liberation is sought through domination, but domination cannot deliver release. Confucian philosophy adds yet another dimension. Confucianism emphasizes relational harmony, moral duty, and responsibility to the social whole. These crimes reflect a total collapse of relational ethics. Other human beings are no longer perceived as members of a shared moral order. They become objects within a private system, stripped of social significance. In rejecting communal bonds, the offender also rejects accountability. Society becomes irrelevant. Rules are no longer collective agreements, but personal inventions. This moral isolation is dangerous because it allows the individual to operate without reference to shared values. Violence becomes permissible as long as it aligns with internal logic. Understanding this mindset also helps explain why the case remains unsolved. Practically, investigative technology in the 1970s was limited. Surveillance was sparse, forensic science was less advanced, and record-keeping was inconsistent. Media pressure further distorted priorities, pushing investigators toward visible progress rather than patient analysis. Psychologically, however, the greater challenge lay in expectation. Investigators often search for motives that resemble familiar narratives: anger, revenge, passion, or gain. The alphabet murders resist these explanations. The offender's logic does not conform to emotional storytelling. It is cold, symbolic, and internally coherent, without being emotionally expressive. Subtle behavioral clues may have been overlooked because they did not fit established profiles. Patterns of observation, lingering presence, and quiet routine integration can appear harmless when not framed correctly. Control-oriented individuals often avoid attention, blending into environments rather than disrupting them. A renewed approach would shift attention away from physical evidence alone and toward behavioral consistency. Patterns of movement, repeated presence across locations, and familiarity with similar environments could expose a profile once considered insignificant. The truth may not lie in dramatic clues, but in small, ordinary details that were overlooked precisely because they appeared too routine to matter. This perspective also raises uncomfortable questions about prevention. If danger hides within routine, then safety cannot rely solely on recognizing extremes. It requires awareness of subtlety, of patterns that feel benign but persist without explanation. This challenges our preference for clear boundaries between normality and threat. The question that lingers has never found an answer. Did the offender stop once the illusion of control felt complete, or did they simply adapt, learning to conceal patterns more effectively? Some individuals cease when their internal needs shift or dissolve. Others continue, refining their methods to avoid notice. In either case, silence provides no comfort. It offers no certainty, no resolution, and no reassurance that the danger truly ended, rather than learning how to disappear. What makes this case especially unsettling is that order itself becomes something to fear. The alphabet, normally associated with childhood, learning, and innocence, is twisted into a framework for deliberate harm. Structure, which people depend on to create meaning, predictability, and safety, is stripped of its comfort. Instead, it becomes a disguise, allowing violence to hide behind logic, routine, and familiarity, reminding us that order without empathy can become one of the most effective masks for cruelty. In the end, the alphabet murders force a confrontation with an uncomfortable reality. Rationality does not guarantee morality. Patterns do not promise understanding. And order, when severed from empathy, can conceal depths of cruelty that remain invisible until it is too late. These unanswered questions endure not merely as investigative failures, but as quiet reminders of how fragile our beliefs about logic, order, and human behavior truly are, especially when reason exists without empathy or moral grounding. Not every crime concludes with a confession or a sense of closure. Some fade into silence, leaving behind only a psychological imprint that lingers long after the facts have gone cold. The alphabet murders remind us that fear does not always emerge from chaos, but often from systems we instinctively trust. Names, patterns, routines, and structures that feel safe and familiar. If fear functions as a mirror, it reflects our deep need for certainty in a world that continually resists it. The most unsettling crimes are rarely loud or dramatic. They are quiet, methodical, and unresolved. Silence, when it refuses to explain itself, can haunt far more deeply than violence ever could. If this story made you pause, reflect, or question what order truly means, consider supporting this channel. Like, share this video, and subscribe to continue exploring cases where the human mind leaves behind more questions than answers. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Minds.